Hi everyone, welcome to a special collaborative recording between LegendFiction and Doxacon. They have a 10th anniversary celebration which is coming up, so if you can join them in person, you absolutely should. And if you can't, here's an opportunity to learn about what Doxacon is, meet some of the people behind the scenes, and find out what the mission is with all of this lovely faith-inspired fiction, which is exactly what legend fiction is all about. So, welcoming people to the show today, we have Father David on, if you're watching on YouTube, over here on this side, we have Daniel, and we have Cindy. Welcome, friends. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Can we start with a brief overview of what is Doxacon, why the name, a little bit of its history, and before we do that, let's start with 30-second or 3-minute, however you like, brief bios, like who are you and how do you relate to Doxacon? And Father, would you like to go first?
Yep. Can you hear me?
We hear you fine.
Okay, good. Sorry, I thought I hit mute. I'm the old guy here, so I have problems with technology. Doxacon. Well, Daniel and I were sitting around, and I make kind of no secret in my day-to-day parish life that I'm a big fantasy and sci-fi geek, and we had been talking about this for a while as kindred spirits. And around that time, Comic-Con was happening in San Diego, and we were just kind of chatting, and we thought, wouldn't it be cool if there was something like that for Christians?
Mm-hmm.
And, my wife overheard it and said, you guys are going to do that. Go make it happen. And I was like, yes, ma'am. So that's kind of the origins,
Yeah,
very
just
simply.
put your staff in the tip of the water and the sea will split. Just
And
do it.
make it so. Yeah, and a big part of it was realizing that there needed to be some kind of space available for the conversations that we were having kind of individually, but that we felt like maybe there are more people out there who have no one to talk about this stuff with from a Christian perspective.
Right.
Because a lot of this stuff obviously is in the popular culture and for many decades was considered to be antithetical to the gospel, even though there's a very strong history of Christian involvement with these genres.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Father David and I really resonated on was growing up in, faith traditions that really discouraged exploration and discussion of these topics in a Christian setting. So, Father David grew up Orthodox. I grew up, evangelical and converted to Orthodoxy later. But we had this very similar, upbringing that really discouraged talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we, grew to love them and to really identify a lot of really interesting things with them, later on, we were like, well, wait, why are our traditions telling us we can't explore these things that are, wonderful and true and beautiful?
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And very briefly, Cindy, what's your background and how'd you get involved with Doxacon?
Okay. I have a little bit of a different background here. I have a very wide-ranging religious background, but I had been Orthodox in 1999, left the Orthodox Church, and one Sunday morning found myself at St. Mary's because of a major storm that had made it impossible for me to get the visibility to go 6 miles to the Melkite church that I was attending, which also has a liturgy that looks exactly like an Orthodox liturgy. And I ended up there and heard about Doxacon at the end of the liturgy, and debated for the next week whether to attend or not, and then did attend. I had never personally felt guilty about exploring these things, but when I went to Doxacon, it was like suddenly there were all these people who were just like me and
Yeah.
wanting to explore these ideas and these genres. And the next day I went back to my Melkite church, which I have very good relations with, and was speaking with the deacon's wife, who's a friend of mine, and she heard me just talking about Doxacon, and she said, "You're going to end up at St. Mary's." and she was right. St. Mary's is ground zero for Doxacon. So
Wow. And so now you're coming up to 10 years. How has Doxacon grown over the last 10 years? And if anybody wants to go at any point, just interrupt and jump in here. Obviously, Father, I'll go with you first. But how has Doxacon grown over the last 10 years?
In fits and starts, as becomes all Christian ministries, but each year it's about building a network of people primarily, and we've got a growing network of not only writers, but many, of course, readers and consumers, but also Christian thinkers, clergy, theologians, people all getting in on this conversation. We've franchised out to a second conference that is still goes on in Seattle, Doxacon Seattle. So we're very proud of them, and
Fantastic.
shout out to them. And so our growing is very humble, but at the same time we are diligent and pursuing the prize.
The first year that we did it was just had really explosive growth. That first year we had, over 100 people at the very first conference. And so
Amazing.
There was just this real demand for it right away. And then, as Father David said, it grew kind of in, starts and fits. We originally didn't do it every year. We did it every other year, and that impeded our process a little bit. But it really grew. And then unfortunately we kind of had this momentum going, I feel like. And then in 2020, we had to make the really hard decision about whether to do virtual or in person. We actually went virtual. We went virtual for 2 years, and then last year was our first year back in person. And that's always been such an important part of Doxacon. I think, actually coming together, breaking bread, fellowshipping. And so we're really happy to be back in person this year.
Fantastic. Cindy, what's it been like for you since, I think you said 2019?
Yeah, 2019. Well, for me, I actually, speaking of what Daniel just said, I wanted to speak at Doxacon, and I had an idea, and I submitted a proposal, and then they changed how they were doing it, and they changed the theme, and so I submitted a second proposal. So I ended up speaking at that first online Doxacon, but I had already submitted an entirely different proposal for the face-to-face Doxacon. So that was really kind of cool, getting to submit 2 proposals to Doxacon. And then I think the next year they tapped me to do some moderating. And then the next year they tapped me to, kind of head the team. So it's been a very interesting experience for me, because all I wanted to do was just, be able to give a little Doxa talk, and ended up being part of the leadership team.
That's so fun. Yeah, just hang out with like-minded dorks. So what's the dream for the future, for the next 10 years? And tell us what's happening at your 10th anniversary celebration. What's going to happen?
Are you asking me?
Anybody. Father, would you like to go ahead?
Go ahead, Cindy.
Okay. One of the things that we've been talking about is growing our social media presence, and also growing the community. That's one of the things that Legend Fiction is really great at, is growing the community. So we're starting to do a lot more with our social media spaces, and we've talked a little bit about having some online offerings that are not our main convention, our main conference.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, so we're talking about some of those things, at least on the social media and marketing team we are. And so those are some things we really would like to grow that presence, and have more awareness in our space. But also this year we really had an awesome experience of one of our speakers from last year had talked a lot about Tim Powers, and another speaker from last year gave Daniel his email address. So I can punt over to Daniel, and he can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was really a great happenstance that we had all these people who were like, you should bring in Tim. And one of our speakers from last year, as he mentioned, Eve Tushnet, is close friends with Tim, and so made that connection for us, and that really opened up a lot of other things too. One of the speakers I'm looking forward to the most is Kenneth Haidt, who is a role playing game designer who I've been following for years. And we were able to reach out to him and be like, "Hey, do you want to be on a panel with Tim Powers?" And he was like, "Yeah, of course." And that really opened up a lot of doors. And so the programming has been my kind of primary passion at Doxacon these years. And I was in Sydney's shoes, being the kind of primary organizer for most of that time. And I've taken a step back to focus on the programming. And so, for me, it's going to be about going forward, making sure that we're getting, a really great set of speakers each year, and making sure that they're people who people are interested in hearing from, and who have, something really interesting to say to people, and making sure that, we have a great like theme and, thing that's bringing everyone together.
Father, any follow-up thoughts?
Yeah, I'm looking forward, especially not only to all of them, but also our clergy keynote this year, which is Deacon Nicholas Kotar. He's I think he's the choir director at Holy Trinity Jordanville Seminary in upstate New York. But he's also an incredible writer, and he was one of our earliest speakers before he was even ordained. And now this year he's coming back as our clergy keynote, having a whole series of fantastic novels under his belt. The Song of the Siren and its sequels, I think it's called the Raven Sun trilogy,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
based on Russian folktales. And just the way he's grown as a writer is so impressive to me that now I'm reading his stuff thinking, like we were talking about Caranulo, this stuff needs to be out there. It needs to be recognized. It needs to be shared. It's such quality material, and it's telling these stories in ways that are true and traditional to the kind of the core material of our not only the gospel but the folk tales and all that, but still feel alive and fresh and really engaging. So I'm excited to see how these different writers mature over the decade and into the next following decades, and to see if we can inspire and encourage more people to get involved as well.
So can we talk about that now? Let's talk about the need for faith-inspired fiction. And I think we might all agree on the fact that we need it. And I'm sure each of us then are going to have a different reason why. And I'm curious to ask that. So why do you think faith-inspired fiction is needed? And Father, would you like to go first, and then we can go around?
Yeah, I was in a meeting recently with clergy, and one of the clergy actually raised the criticism that we should avoid trying to use terms like the Christian story, because that language is part and parcel of kind of a postmodernist approach to, all truth being your story or being relative. And I was like, I get where that's coming from, but to me, that's like saying, don't ever use the term myth, or don't ever use the term epic, or whatever. I mean, all story is something that is real. It can be fiction, but the truth that's contained within the story is truth. Truth is truth, no matter where you find it. So for me, these generating of art, I consider them art, not just simply fiction. It's just a subset of art. The storyteller's art is really bringing truth, beauty, and goodness to light. And that is part of our experience as Christians in the image of God, who told stories himself.
Yeah, and I think one of the really important things that Doxacon has talked about over the years is Saint Basil, in his talk to the youth, talks about using pagan literature of the time to draw out these, truths that we can share with them. And to me, that's always been the motivating factor in discussing these different genres. And I think, especially today, in such a kind of materialistic world that likes to deny, the idea of like the supernatural or the divine, these genre fiction is so often aligned with us if we let them, talking about these kind of transcendent truths. And so I think we do ourselves a disservice when we ignore them and kind of ignore like an ally that we have in the modern world.
I just want to jump in, Cindy. I think that's such a fascinating way to put it, the surprising ally in the modern world. There's been a what is it? It's not a myth. It's a allegory that I think Chesterton created at some point, where he's like, modern man is like somebody waking up in the remnants of a shipwreck, and there's all these pieces and equipment just lying around him from spirituality and myth and history, and he has no idea how these things go together, and he may end up cobbling together some things to do completely weird, unorthodox intentions or whatever. And it might take somebody who does understand how these things work to come along and actually provide some sense of orientation. But the remnants and the pieces are all still valuable, and somebody could intuit a meaning or intuit a connection between two things that we never did. So I like that. It's a surprising friend in modern culture, and I think we see that a lot. Over to you, Cindy, because you've actually you've shared with me some of your own ideas about different popular pieces of media actually having very deep meaning and so on. What do you think on this topic?
Well, I actually had a conversation with Father David probably around January about Game of Thrones, and he's actually got a background with comparative religion. That was his degrees were in comparative religion as an undergrad and so on. And he was telling me that, and this was something I hadn't really noticed, was how well developed the religions are in Game of Thrones, in a Song of Ice and Fire series. And not long after that, I took a course at Hellenic College and wrote a paper on Game of Thrones and found some surprising elements in there that we can actually learn something from as Christians. Frequently, people dismiss Game of Thrones because of its violence and because of the sex scenes and so on. But I found some very interesting things that I'm going to be sharing at Doxacon, so I will not be, telling you right here. But at any rate, my own personal history is very deeply embedded with literature. I was a literature major in college, studied for a PhD in literature. But probably the most important moments in my life as a Christian were in my undergrad experience when I was really in rebellion big time. And Dostoevsky, who's not a fantasy author, but Dostoevsky really blew my mind, and really got me thinking about issues of faith. And that was very interesting because at the time, everybody was talking about Dostoevsky as an existentialist, an existential Christian writer. And when I read him through an Orthodox lens later, I was like, no, he's just Orthodox. He's they're reading him as existential because they don't know Orthodoxy. So it's like he's just an Orthodox Christian writer. That's really it. But also another big moment for me was one of the times that I saw Star Wars during the summer of its first release, because I'm actually older than Father David. He said he's the old guy. He's not. But at any rate, I saw it in its summer of first release. And I had this big moment where Luke is looking at the twin suns. And I don't know what that did, but it's sort of one of those, I guess, C.S. Lewis surprised by joy moments or something where, suddenly there's this real longing in me for God. And it was like that moment that I stopped, questioning the existence of a deity.
Wow.
Yeah. Isn't that weird? Star Wars.
How curious.
Yeah.
Any follow-ups from anybody on anything? Just chiming in on this.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm thinking about there was one of the first things I ever saw that got me excited was written in maybe the 90s, after the first series, before the prequels, and it was by an Orthodox bishop, um, Lazar Puhalo, who actually went through and showed how in Star Wars, George Lucas, who of course stole so many of his ideas from other people, um, but he
As one
also,
does.
yeah, as one does, we all do, but he stole a lot from the Desert Fathers. You know, the
Oh,
idea of
interesting.
Obi-Wan as a desert ascetic, you know, teaching dispassion and mentoring in a spiritual way. And he goes through this, and so instead of saying, let's not just say give up the idea of the Force as some kind of Hindu idea or something like that, like so many people were doing. Rather, if we look at the Force as kind of representing arete, you know, virtue, the strength of the Holy Spirit in our lives, and how, you know, you take that energy and you grow with it and you build it for good. If you misuse it, of course, you can go to your own condemnation, which is the falling to the dark side. But he really laid this whole interpretation of Star Wars out that really got me excited, because I was like, finally, you know, somebody who's seeing things, and even seeing things I didn't see, you know, really bringing them to life. And a lot of what the talks that we have at Doxacon do that. They take stuff that you'd never have thought about in a Christian sense and just
Right.
blow them up. Last year we had Father Turbo Qualls, who I am still shook over this talk he gave about the anti-hero, where he found
Yeah.
Christ in R.A. Salvatore's Drow character Drist, and Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melnibone. I mean, just two of my favorite characters from high school that I would never have thought about in a Christian way, but he did it. I was just, I'm still happy. So, like, that happens every year. Something like that happens every year on multiple talks. And it's like you walk
Yeah.
away and your soul feels expanded. It's an amazing experience.
I agree. I agree. Daniel, and ask you that, keep going the same thing in a second, like your experience with this. For me, I remember like 10 years ago or so, I was uh, expanding on my faith journey, I guess you could say. And someone like Bishop Barron, at the time he was Father Barron, and he would be doing his movie reviews and so on. And as a kid, I'd watch him and think, what are you doing? You're not denouncing the evil that is present in these movies, and you're dangerous for people and whatever. And then I'd go and I'd watch movies and I would kind of love them, but then I feel morally obligated to write these diatribes or these denunciations, you know, and then life happened and I got older and come back and realize everything that he did and exactly what you're describing is this more mature ability to look beyond the parameters of what the story sets up and to ground that within a larger narrative and maybe accept that the characters in the story or whoever's telling the story may be misunderstanding what it is they're actually dealing with and then making choices based on that misunderstanding. But we're able to approach that. I like you said, everybody thinks all these Christians are so existentialist and dramatic. It's like, it's just Sunday liturgy for normies, you know. But they're not used to this kind of clarity of the deep magic, you know, the deep realities of things. And so that's just absolutely fascinated me. And now almost everything that I'll watch, I'll try to think, how can we sort of get a mystic tilt of the head to look under the surface and where is God actually in this? And I've grown to really have an appreciation for, what is it like? Well, there's horror movies and anti-hero movies, and there's a reason why anti-hero characters are on the rise for an extremely self-righteous, you know, first world West culture. And there's a reason why we love these characters. I think it's a spiritual kind of act of confession, spiritual need to remind ourselves that, you know, be careful. The self-righteous always end up turning into anti-heroes. Daniel, what do you think about with all of this?
I think you're right on. And you know, when we started Doxacon, I don't think we ever really considered the horror genre all that much. And then we started realizing there was this, you know, great audience for it. I think Eve Tushnet was our first speaker who came and talked about, you know, the horror genre, and we just got such a reaction from people, and now we have like, Karen Illo and Eleanor Borg Nicholson, and Tim Powers and all these people, who deal with the horror genre, and I think, and Eve has like talked to me about this a lot, and I think I'm really convinced. Like horror, I think is probably the genre that is most closely aligned to us, actually, because it deals with these deep truths, and accepts the idea of like the supernatural and the transcendent at face value. And I remember Eve's talk at the, I think it was the second or third Doxacon, where she talked about just even the tropes of the horror genre harken back to Christianity, in the sense that when you have something that's happening, there's a ghost, or there's a monster going along, you always go first to the materialist, the scientist, and they don't have the answer, and so then you have to go to the old priest, who has like who knows the things that everyone else has forgotten, or you have to go to the child with their childlike innocence. Let the children come to me. You have to go to them to discover these hidden truths, and the knowledge that will save us in the end. And so yeah, the horror genre just has so much to share, I think, and I think Christianity, most traditions, I think, have kind of started to slowly accept the fantasy and the sci-fi. I think Tolkien and Lewis obviously have wide acceptance, I think, and even Harry Potter, I think, has become somewhat acceptable in most circles.
Finally.
And but I think kind of our next the next thing we need to do is start getting acceptance for the horror genre, I think, and I think Karen and Eleanor are on the forefront of that.
I've never understood why Christians feel queasy about horror. If you've ever read the lives of the saints and the martyrdoms, they're pretty gruesome. They'll put any slasher film to shame.
It's true. I think I think maybe we've misunderstood. First of all, there are a lot of bad, silly horror stories, and there are some really good ones too. And so if you're not familiar with a category of anything, and all you see are the silly ones, then of course you're going to write the whole thing off, as most do. But I think what I've seen with a lot of horror movies is for it to qualify as horror, it can't just be horrific. It's got to be horror, which almost always means it's some sort of a cautionary tale. It's like the anti-hero on steroids. It doesn't matter how hard you try, because it's meant to be the complete unbridled consequences of complete rejection of anything that could save you, or maybe like I was just watching a horror film yesterday, which was a whole lot of fun with aliens and stuff. But the whole point was that because you're so fundamentally unprepared to deal with reality, when it shows up on your front door, that's it. There's nothing you can do. And in a way, it may not be totally your fault, but it's certainly a reflection on your culture. And I think that's, Cindy, you and I have chatted about Game of Thrones. I think that's the fundamental contention for Game of Thrones, is that sort of thing. So I'm just curious, what then is a movie, sort of putting this into practice, what's a movie you'll have seen, let's say this past year, this past month, that you really, really liked and perhaps was not overtly Christian, but you end up walking away from it thinking that was just delightfully deep?
Can we substitute a piece of writing? Because
Yeah,
I haven't
absolutely.
seen a lot of movies in the last few months. I've been reading a lot for Doxacon, because I'm trying to become conversant with our various authors. But a couple of things that really have blown me away in the reading that I've done, actually, I'm going to mention three things, actually. I think Karen Ulo's Jennifer the Damned completely blew my mind. I'm a big adherent of the horror genre, have been all my life. I met my husband at a horror film convention, Okay, so this is one of the little secrets of Cindy that doesn't get expressed very much. But yes, I have a lot of experience with horror, and that was just an incredible novel. It was profoundly Christian and yet at the same time not preachy, and it did what it did in a really awesome way. Also, I recently read Tim Powers' novel Declare, which is from 2000, and it's kind of a marriage between a John le Carre Cold War spy novel and the Lord of Spirits podcast, which is a sort of Orthodox thing, but everybody's welcome to listen to it. It's also kind of one of the things that Tim Powers does, I think, is he relies a lot upon these ancient evils, which I think are kind of aligned with Lovecraft. So it's kind of Lovecraftian in that way. It's really an awesome novel. It's he really nails the le Carre aspect of it, but he also really nails the supernatural horror aspect of it. And then what was the other one that I was going to mention? That's probably enough for now. But those are a couple of the things that I've read recently that really were mind blowing for me.
That's fantastic. I interviewed Karen Yulo, so before Legend Haven, and the title of her talk was the one that we just dug into, where she says horror is the genre of the sacred,
Hmm.
and it could be the sacred celebrated or the sacred denied, and it's usually horror because you've denied that. So if anybody's wondering why are we spending so much time on horror, well, that's why. Very existentialist stuff. Daniel or Father, would you like to go?
So I actually just finished a book called Menu by S.K. Ahira, who's going to be one of our moderators this year at Doxacon and was a speaker last year. And she does some really amazing work with both horror and fantasy. And this novel is, a combination of the two. And it deals with one of the most interesting protagonists I've seen in a while, because this protagonist has been injured and incapacitated by the big bad in the story, and it's kind of the story of the aftermath of that, and it just is a wonderful concept of strength and weakness, and which I think is such a Christian concept. And so you know so I think so much fantasy, especially these days, and even when we're talking about like anti-heroes, it has this like tinge of like power fantasy to it, where the hyper competent and near perfect protagonist, and to see this one who deals with his own weaknesses and has to learn to depend on something beyond himself, I think is such a valuable lesson to learn. So yeah, I would look up SK Hira, and yeah, she's going to be at Doxacon this year. So
That is cool. Father, how about you? Anything really stand out to you recently?
I watch so much garbage. I was trying to sift through my memory banks to come up with something redeeming to talk about, but it's so hard because I've seen so much garbage in the last year. Um, yeah, so I don't want to. The thing I'm really enjoying right now is Nicholas Kotar's Song of the Sirens. So that's what's really been speaking to my soul.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking about, was we were talking about the horror as the cautionary tale. My favorite horror movie maker appropriate for this season is John Carpenter. Old school, kind of minimalist, simple effects, does his own music. I just love his movies, all of them. And I introduced my daughter this summer to The Fog, the
Ooh.
original, not the remake from 2000 something. The original The Fog by John Carpenter, in my opinion, is the greatest horror movie ever made. I love it so much. I could watch it over and over again. It's a perfect ghost story.
Yeah, that's nice. I haven't seen the old one. I have seen the newer one, but I know about the ending of the old one and controversy around that and whatever. But that's, yeah. More recently for me, I watched what is it one called? A Monster Calls, which is about a young boy dealing with the passing of his mother and then his own needing. It's like a dark fairy tale, funnily enough, and it absolutely just was incredible, just really something. And then there was another one that also came up, and I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank. Anyhow, so that was one. one of the things that I've seen over the last 100 years is this deepening of understanding of psychology in storytelling. Whereas before, perhaps it was more mythic and it was more spiritual. There's now if you could call it, a greater specificity of spiritual reality, and then that becomes psychology. For example, the Batman Begins trilogy by Christopher Nolan. I mean, was rewatching that recently, and I had to stop leaning over and saying, "Hey," to my wife, "Look at this theme, and how did I never see this before?" You know, it's for me, I rank that as one of the top contributions towards cinema of the last century, in terms of the depth of somebody unwilling to deal with his shadow and unwilling to accept the impact of that, and the fact that it blows out of control because of a lack of a father figure. And then throughout each of the different elements of the trilogy is the pursuing of different father figures, and then the lack of a mother figure, the pedestaling of women throughout the trilogy. Now, if somebody wants to argue with me and you want to come do it on the show, please do, because I'd love to talk about that, and it's fun.
It sounds like a good episode of Cinema Therapy.
I love cinema therapy. Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of thing that's really motivated me with like legend fiction, and wanting to encourage and foment conversations like these, because we need a lot more of them. It's either you're watching a movie and you're too unreflective, and you're an adult and you're not supposed to be that unreflective, or there's just a complete dismissal of anything that's actually good in it. So, well, starting to wrap up. One, where can people find out more about Doxacon? And then what's on the menu for Doxacon this year? Cindy, would you like to?
Okay. Our website is doxacon.org. And we also have a pretty now active Facebook page. It's just basically Doxacon Prime, because we're distinguishing ourselves from Doxacon Seattle. As Father mentioned, we franchised out to Doxacon Seattle, so they are part of the Doxacon family, but we do want to have our own space on Facebook as well. So Doxacon Prime is a place to come and, just kind of join the conversation. We're having some pretty fun conversations, actually. And in terms of what is actually on the menu this time, I think that I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, because he put together the program.
Yeah, so our clergy keynote speaker this year is going to be Deacon Nicholas Kotar, as we've mentioned, and he is giving just a wonderful talk on St. Basil's address to young men, which, he and I had a long discussion about what he wanted to talk about this year, for the 10th anniversary. And we both decided that going back to this really important text for us was key to that. And then, of course, we have Tim Powers, who's going to be our lay keynote speaker, and he's going to be talking about fantasy fiction through a Catholic lens. And of course, he is just such a wonderful author to be talking about that. We're really excited to have him. Kenneth Haidt, is going to be talking about Lovecraft and the influence that Lovecraft had on his work, and we're just so excited about that. We have Stephanie Slade, who is a senior editor over at Reason Magazine, and she's going to be talking about Game of Thrones along with Sydney. There's going to be a two-part conversation, and then we'll have a really fun, we hope, question and answer session afterwards. Karen and Eleanor are going to be talking. They're going to be giving a joint talk as well, and it's called, and this is just a wonderful time, we workshopped this for so long, it's called Suffocation and Ritual Dismemberment, Speculative Fiction and the Spiritual Life. And wow. They are just both amazing. They've been speakers multiple times at Doxacon, and I'm so happy that they're giving this wonderful talk together. And then finally we have Brian Glass, and his title is "Who Are You? What Do You Want? The Origins of Character, Our Baggage, and the Backstory of Humanity," which fans will recognize that as a Babylon 5 reference, and that is indeed what he's going to be talking about. So yeah, I was just blown away by the response we got this year when I reached out to people and was like, hey, we're having our 10th anniversary. Do you want to come and speak at Doxacon? And they were just very eager to talk about it. So.
That just sounds like
if you're not sure if you should come, The answer is yes, you should come. Don't wait any longer.
Absolutely. Okay, last few minutes. Any final words of encouragement that you'd like to leave with authors who are committed to their craft and just as committed to their faith, and finding a way to craft faith-inspired fiction? Father, anything you'd like to leave with them?
I think it was an Orthodox bishop of blessed memory, Anthony Bloom, who said, God cannot, God can save the sinner you are, not the saint you pretend to be. And I think one of the most important things as a writer is to have self-awareness and self-acceptance of who you are. And if you can translate into how you write your characters, I think you'll come to places of beauty. The thing I notice that I see between Christian writers and those who have an opposing way of looking at things, maybe, is the way they treat their characters. Because every character you write is an extension of yourself. It's an expression of your own soul. It's a projection of a type within you, so to speak. And if that character is presented with love and understanding and a certain gentleness and lack of, judgment even for their failures, that becomes a dynamic character that can really grow and become something people can relate to. If it's a character that's just a stereotype or a shadow, a projection of hatred, I think those works suffer and they lack substance and depth. So love and self-awareness and knowledge are hallmarks of Christian spiritual life. And if you apply them to your craft, God will bless it.
That's beautiful. And hey, I got a riff on it. We can publish the writer you are, but not the writer you pretend to be. Daniel, anything you'd like to leave, if you had a minute to share some words of encouragement?
I would say, I know it's hard and it feels like you're not reaching an audience, but we are there. I was again blown away when we had our first Doxacon at the hunger there was for it. And now when when I go places, when I go to parishes and I visit, and St. Mary's comes up or Doxacon comes up, and people are so excited to hear about it, and there is just such an audience out there. We just need to make that last mile connection between the author and the writer. And I think places like Doxacon, places like LegendFiction are what that's for. So keep going. We're almost there.
Fantastic. Cindy, will you close us out?
Well, it's been a long, long time since I've written fiction, and I am actually very excited to start thinking about doing it again, because I've been reading these authors and I'm like, I really need to do this. I really need to explore some of these things. And Tim Powers has been very inspiring to me, and just the idea that you can take history and be faithful to the history, but write the secret history behind it was actually a very exciting concept to me. And so one of the things that I would say, and this is actually something that I would tell my students when I was teaching just prose nonfiction writing, was the key to good writing is reading. And the more you read, the more you absorb how writing works, the more you absorb how writing sounds, because writing is not just the way you talk. It's a different way of processing language. And so the more you read, the more you learn how writing can process language. And also you can experiment with it. But I'm a big encourager of reading. And like I said, just reading Tim Powers is inspiring to me, and reading Karen Ulo and reading reading Eleanor Borg Nicholson, sorry, and reading these authors is really inspiring and making me want to, dip in again and start creating characters and building worlds.
What a great place to wrap. Thank you, everybody who joined us. And if you haven't yet, check the link in the description to visit doxacon.org. Support them, register, join them. And then if not, I believe the replays will be available online afterwards, after some period. Yes?
Ancient Faith Radio.
Fantastic. Okay, and then hit the other link that's also in the description to come and check out LegendFiction.com, which is the creative community for Catholic and Orthodox faith-inspired fiction writers, mostly sci-fi and fantasy, but we have all kinds of writers in there as a place to give and get feedback, share your works in progress, and maybe triple your writing output because we're having so much fun together. So thank you all for coming on. This was wonderful to meet you, and we wish you all a very happy and excellent Doxacon 10th anniversary celebration.